Hello and welcome back to ID Boxing with me, your host, Rob Tebbutt. As always, I'd like to remind everybody to please like, comment and subscribe, turn your notifications on for more boxing content. Just me and Andy Clarke this week. We have got rid of Barry Jones finally. It's taken a little while, but he has finally gone away. But Andy, always a pleasure to catch up with you and to not have that yappity little Welshman in the middle of us.
He's very persistent, isn't he? He's very persistent. So this has taken some time. He'll probably turn up halfway through.
Yeah, hopefully not. Hopefully not. But you never know. So usually he's outside and you have to drag him in or drag him out, or depending on how we're going. But no, in all seriousness, Barry couldn't be with us today. He's tending to some personal stuff. Hope everything's all right with Mr. Jones and the clan. But Barry, there we go. See, on the brain. Andy Clarke. Full schedule of boxing coming this week, and of course there was last week as well. So let's start right the way back at York Hall on Friday for your BT Sport. Was that your debut on BT Sport?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And I was lucky because it was a really good night. I did genuinely. I always fancy any card I do because you get into it in real depth and you see things that other people just don't see really. And I'm always optimistic. I thought it was a solid card with a good British middleweight title fight at the top of it, and Zorro-Spelman I thought had the potential to be good, and then a load of prospects, plenty of whom I was looking forward to seeing in the flesh for the first time. And it was just one of those nights that just kind of snowballed and got better and better in the last three fights. Yeah, Zorro-Spelman was great, and that got more interesting as it went on. Then Barney-Smith with a tremendous 30-second blowout just kept the momentum going, and then Bentley against Morrison was just good right from the beginning. So it was great to be back at it wasn't completely packed, but a full enough and really noisy York Hall for some just great scraps. And that place always looks good on TV. The noise is always terrific. And from a selfish point of view, if you're working for someone for the first time, the last thing you want is a stinker. And it certainly wasn't that. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Yeah, good pace to the show. You've kind of alluded to it there. Like it kind of built to this crescendo towards the end, which was like a nice shootout really for the British title. So let's start there and work our way down. Denzel Bentley retains his middleweight title against Marcus Morrison. I mean, as far as first rounds go, you won't see many better first rounds than that in a British ring or indeed abroad. What a brilliant first 3 minutes that was.
It was great, and it just it seesawed, didn't it, those 3 minutes? And what was good about the fight was that Bentley won it comfortably in the end because he stopped him in the fourth. But that first round was terrific, and Morrison was determined, you could see, to throw whenever Bentley threw. Every time Bentley threw, he threw straight back. And he hurt him towards the end of the round. Denzel said afterwards he caught him around the back of the head, but he definitely buzzed him, he admitted that. And I gave Morrison the first round. I thought he won that first round because of the good finish, and it was just great. It was Morrison. I just remember his fight against Wellborn really clearly because I commentated on that one, and at that point, the red carpet had been rolled out and everything was going great, and then he got derailed, and since then he's had it tough. So you knew that he had the minerals on him for a scrap, and if he felt that was how he needed to try and do it to win, then he had the balls to do it, and that's what he tried. And in the end, it didn't work. But whilst it lasted, it was great to watch, and great stoppage from Joe Gallagher.
Yeah, really good,
because he was only going one way at that point, and he knows that he's got a brave fighter in there. And I was glad to see him slide through the ropes and stop it, because by that point he was taking a bit of a pasting, still on his feet. But taking a hiding, really.
Yeah, good stoppage from Joe Gallagher. And you kind of mentioned the Jason Wellborn fight earlier on. That was a fight where, a lot of people thought that Joe should have stepped in.
Yeah.
Obviously, different stages of their careers. We spoke about it briefly afterwards, where we're going to come on to young Frank Arnold, where at the early stages of your career, sometimes you can be forgiving people too much of an opportunity because, you're young, you're unbeaten, you've got all of the kind of hyperbole and the push behind you. But I thought it was a very good stoppage from Joe Gallagher, the right time. I think he gave Morrison just just enough time. I mean, it's probably going to be the last time that we see Marcus Morrison box for a major title, certainly a British title. Gave him every opportunity, but called it in the 4th round. Good win for Denzel Bentley. We're going to try and skate through things, so we have got a lot to talk about. But you've mentioned there, young Royston Barney-Smith. Sometimes, particularly when you're coming off the back of a fight like Zorro-Spelman, which was all action, up and down kind of fight, the last thing you want is, a 4-rounder or a 6-rounder to go. It really sucks the life out of York Hall and takes that buzz away. But that's not what we saw. A really impressive 30-second blowout for Royston Barney-Smith. He was the prospect, I think, that you picked as the one to watch before the show, and it turned out that way. Yeah,
he was. Well, he pinned him with a left hand with the first punch he threw, which was about 5 or 6 seconds in. Paul Holt, former area champion, away corner guy now. Said before the fight that he was thinking this might be his last one, and if ever anything's going to persuade you that you're done, it'll probably be that, because I thought he did well to stay on his feet after that first left hand, and then he just stepped in and threw the same combination again, really, and that was it. And it was impressive because we've had a lot of people turn pro young, particularly signed by Queensberry over the last couple of years, and he's one of them. He was 17 when he decided to turn pro, 18 when he made his debut, and he's making strides. He's got confidence. He's good to watch. He sells some tickets. And that was, like you say, it was ideal, because what you don't want is some kind of mood hoover just to get into the ring and just sweep away, vacuum away all that momentum you build at the end of Spelman Zorro. And he did the opposite of that. And that will really endear you to your promoter, because that kind of display against a good guy in Holt is, it's exactly what you want.
Absolutely. We've mentioned it, Zorro-Spelman. I think we spoke briefly off camera beforehand. I think it was kind of the best version of what it was going to be. I think we looked at it on the preview show and thought, Spelman moving up to cruiserweight, and we still weren't really sure about Zorro. He won the boxer tournament, but again, over 10 rounds or over 8 rounds as it was, against an experienced guy like Spelman. It was going to be interesting to see how he handled those mid to late rounds. And Spelman more than had his moments in there. And I think while Zorro, there's still somewhat of an unknown quantity, there's something that we can go off now. We've seen him go in there with somebody like Dex Spelman, who's very experienced, took some shots. He was badly hurt at one point as well. More than one occasion he was hurt, had a busted nose, but he was able to see it through. And it was the type of fight that I felt like watching an 8-rounder where I wanted those extra 2 rounds, or if it was a championship fight over 12 rounds, I wonder how those last 2 or 4 rounds went. But all in all, I think, it's slow and steady with Ellis Zorro, of course, but I think a good fight for us to see where he is in his career, and a good fight for him where he ticks some boxes.
Yeah, it was a massive gut check, wasn't it? That was the main thing about it. And I went to see him in the gym beforehand, and he said that, this was the ideal fight for him, and he felt that if he was disciplined enough and fit enough, and could snap his punches hard enough, which he was totally confident he could, then he would beat Spelman. And he was doing a good job of it through the first 5. Had the knockdown as well with the
lovely
body shot, which was a great body shot, and he looked nice and composed. Spelman was trying to get on top of him, and it wasn't really working. But then his plan was always going to be to drag him into deep waters late on, the old cliche. But he did. He did. The 7th round was amazing, absolutely incredible stuff. And it was a great finish. And he was in terrible trouble at points, Zorro. He really was. And if he didn't really have the stomach for it, he'd have lost. He'd have lost, because there were times there where it only would have taken a few more seconds of him getting hit without much coming back, and Martin Bowers might have stopped it, because it was getting to that kind of point.
Yeah.
But he did well to dig in, and at the end you expected him to get the decision, and it was right that he did, because he did enough good stuff in the first half of the fight. But if we'd had 2 more, God, it would have been interesting, because I thought he did pretty well in the 8th, Zorro. But Spelman said to me the day before at the weigh-in that the old cruiser limit of 190, 13 stone 8 would have been absolutely perfect.
Yeah, you can definitely see that.
The extra 10, 14 pounds it was in the end, because they said it at 203, I think. I'm not sure why, because he's made cruiser before Zorro without any particular problem. It's just a bit too much. But you got to love him, haven't you, Spelman? He's a terrific pro, and it was the ideal fight for Zorro. But I think they'll probably realise that he was talking about the winner of Lawal and Juma for the British. That's too soon. Luke Watkins is English champion. That could be a real interesting fight because he's an experienced guy, and he would fancy that big time. I think Luke.
Yeah, that's a good fight. I like that. Luke Watkins has been in there with pretty much everybody at domestic level over the years. Always been competitive apart from the Okoli fight. Obviously, Okoli has gone on to do great things. Before we move on and hear from Frank Warren, let's touch upon quite an unsavoury incident on the undercard, in my opinion, which was young Frank Arnold, obviously previously unbeaten, had that draw with Brett Fido, knocked out in pretty brutal fashion. I didn't like that. I felt like there was an opportunity there to save young Frank Arnold from what happened. He was badly hurt earlier on in the fight. He was dropped very heavily. As we spoke about before, the gum shield came out, which kind of gave the referee an opportunity really to, obviously he has to wipe the gum shield down, get it back in, but kind of gave him that extra 10, 15 seconds whereby Frank Arnold was, I don't think in a position to continue the fight, but you can kind of make the argument, I suppose, after a 9.5 count and then another 10 seconds. But yeah, I didn't like that. I felt that Frank Arnold should have been saved from himself. As you all know, and as we all know as boxing fans, the fighters are always the last people to quit. Generally speaking, the last people who want to be pulled out of the fight. You've got a referee in there, you've got a corner in there, and you've got a 23-year-old kid taking punishment that he doesn't need to be taking. Really upset me. Stuff like that, watching stuff like that really angers me watching it, because if Frank Arnold would have been stopped in the third round when he got hurt, he'd have been devastated, sure. But you could see where he could learn from that and maybe come back on the back of a brutal stoppage like that. Sure, he can still come back, but you'd imagine that after that, that's going to take quite some coming back from.
Yeah, it's a rebuilding process for sure, and it was a very kind of interesting passage of action to commentate on, because these are the kinds of situations that if you kind of fancy that you know what you're doing, then you kind of want, because there's a lot to unpick. And the gum shield came out, which I kind of later forgot, but the knockdown itself was interesting because he got hit by a massive right hand and he was kind of out and then sat on the second bottom rope on his way down, and then Myrena legitimately hit him again, which any fighter would. You could have made the argument that he was down at that point because the ropes were keeping him up, but the fighter's always going to follow up, and there wasn't really time for the referee to jump in. Off the back of that, I don't think the referee should have let it continue. I was slightly unfair to Chaz Coakley in commentary, because he gave him the count and then he was putting the gum shield back in, and I'd kind of forgotten that the gum shield had come out, and I couldn't quite see it, and it looked like he was kind of fudging it to give him more time to recover, which some people would argue that he did to an extent anyway. But when he went back over, he still wasn't steady on his feet, Frank Arnold. He wasn't. And Frampton, after the fight, said the right thing, Carl Frampton, where he said, if it had been the other way around, and this is always a good way to look at it, and it had been Myrena, he'd just stopped the fight. And he would, wouldn't he?
Absolutely, yeah.
And then they've got a minute between rounds to try and get him back together. So I understand why they sent him back out for the start of the round, because they want him to win and they want him to recover, but he hadn't. And I think you've got to recognise that he hadn't. And in the end, he got mercilessly chinned. And it was really concerning, because he was flat on his front. He was a few feet away from me. It's the second time in a few weeks that I've had that. And you wonder what's coming, because bad things can happen in there. It's
a horrible period of time.
Bad things can happen in there. And the medical care was brilliant, as it always is. And it was just a relief to see him get back to his feet. But it didn't need to happen.
Yeah, I felt like he should have been stopped after the first knockdown. When he got up, before going over to sort the gum shield out, you should see that he's not capable of continuing. If the gum shield was in at that point, the fight would have been over. Yeah. You don't allot extra time for him to recover because you've got to put the gum shield in. And then also at the end of that round, he was hanging on. He was taking a lot of shots. Yeah. Referee could have jumped in there. I understand what you're saying about the corner, but we also got the most futile towel throw in the history of the sport. While he was out cold on his way to the floor, they thought it was a good time to throw the towel in. Probably throw the towel in when he sat there and his eyes are rolling around in his head. But anyway, we were fortunate enough to catch up with Frank Warren, of course, promoter of the event, on Friday afterwards. Here's what he had to say about Denzel Bentley and what could lie ahead for the British middleweight champion.
It was a fabulous show, and I thought both of the guys, they give the fans an absolute treat. I think it's a real marvellous fight, and I was really pleased with Denzel, how he came through, and he deserves it. But it's like, take your hat off to Marcus. He come to fight. I mean, that first round was a little bit exciting, to say the least, as the rest of the fight was. There's a lot of things for him to look at, and he's obviously he's an exciting fighter, and obviously there's as you say, there's the European, there's world title, and next year there's a great fight between him and Hamzah, Sheeraz. That's like the Battle of the East End. That will be a mega fight.
So that was Frank Warren in the immediate aftermath of the York Hall show on Friday. Excuse me. So Hamzah Sheeraz versus Denzel Bentley is the fight that he wants to make for the British title. Hamzah Sheeraz has obviously recently moved up, or in his last few fights moved up from 154 pounds. What do you think to that one?
Well, I think it's a brilliant fight for Bentley, because he's a solid, dyed-in-the-wool middleweight and has bedded himself in at a really good level over the last few fights. If I were Team Sheeraz, well, if you're Team Sheeraz, then you know him really well and better than anyone. And they obviously feel, I think, that he is ready for that. Frank feels that he's ready for that. But from the outside looking in, there's a clear favourite in that fight, I think, going into it, and that's Bentley, because he's just a lot more seasoned at that weight and at that level. I'm a bit surprised that they want to do it quite so quickly. I thought they might let that one just age a little bit more, but it's a good fight. It's a really good fight. But at this particular moment in time, I'd be quite strongly favouring Bentley in that fight, I think. I think you'd have to, because you just look at what he's done at that weight compared to Sheeraz. That's not to say that Sheeraz can't take things up a level, but Bentley's just the more proven guy.
I mean, Frank has been very high on Hamzah Sheeraz in recent years, really. I remember him kind of coming up at 154 pounds and getting a lot of lofty praise for some of his performances. He then had the fight with Bradley Skeet, which I think everybody felt that he was losing that fight. Canter, really. Bradley Skeet boxing brilliantly until there was the very contentious shot while he was down on one knee that ultimately changed the fight. And then he knocked out Jed Smith, which I think that was at middleweight, or it might have been 154. But anyway, we know that it's a long way above where Jed Smith should be boxing. And then in his last fight, he was dropped, ultimately won by stoppage, and there was a lot to like about it, but there was a lot of concerns around that performance as well that I felt. So yeah, whether or not they go straight into it next, I'm not sure. Whether or not Hamzah Sheeraz maybe gets one or two, or tries to sneak one or two in before then, I think would probably be advisable. But yeah, an interesting fight nonetheless. So that was the spit and sawdust of York Hall. Of course, the following night, Canelo Alvarez versus Gennadiy Golovkin in the bright lights of Las Vegas. We all sat here, myself, you and Barry, and we all predicted a win for Canelo Alvarez. You guys picked the decision, I picked the stoppage, but sucker born every minute, of course. And yeah, a pretty much as good as the first two fights were. I feel like we all feared what could happened on Saturday night. I felt like Gennadiy Golovkin, who has been a brilliant champion for many, many years, we spoke before about whether or not it was still in Gennadiy Golovkin. You get that moment where the mind's willing, but the body's not able. And I feel like we saw that on Saturday night.
That's exactly what we saw. And I was kind of in denial about it, to be honest. I did say that I thought Canelo would win when we chatted. I did a pod later in the week and I said the same thing, but that I thought the price on Golovkin was tempting enough, and that I gave him a better chance than most people did because of what had happened in the first two fights. But time and tide waits for no man, and it was that situation where you see a fighter who can still see the openings and still see what needs to happen, but they just can't quite do it anymore. They can't quite pull the trigger, as people describe it. And it is the perfect description too, because you're not as quick on the draw as you used to be, and you just can't do it. And at some point it hits everyone, and there's always a fight where it manifests itself more clearly than maybe it has done in a previous couple. If you think about Derevianchenko and Murata, and of course you're in with somebody who's very, very good in Canelo. And yeah, it was just what I really, really, really hoped it wouldn't be, because it does Canelo no favours either. It really doesn't. Golovkin comes out of it, and I don't think anybody really looks at him and thinks, oh, you could have done more, or you could have given more, or anything like that, because he's 40. And from Canelo's point of view, people will look at that trilogy and think, and we touched on this last time, they'll think, well, you lost the first fight, you got protected by the judges. The second fight, yeah, you might have won that. And then the third fight, you made him wait until he was 73. And that's what they'll say about that. So even though a trilogy win, a 2-0 trilogy win over Golovkin should be a spectacular career highlight for Canelo, I don't think it'll go down like that in the history books. I really don't. And it's a shame that it's a shame that in the end that's how it kind of played. That's how it played out. But I mean, it was a good event. Matchroom put on another huge event. I don't know how it did in terms of pay-per-view buys and stuff like that, but it just kind of slightly saddened me, really. Like I say, I just ended up watching what I strongly suspected I would see, but that I just really hoped that I wouldn't.
I think it's kind of it shows a lot that in the wake of the fight that the majority of the focus is on Gennadiy Golovkin and how he looked as opposed to Canelo Alvarez, which I'm sure is not the most pleasing thing to Canelo, which you've kind of alluded to there. In the post-fight press conference, it was put to Gennadiy Golovkin about what lies ahead for him in the future. Here's what he had to say about calls for him to retire from the sport.
When you get home to the beach at age 40, do you think at all that you will be tempted to reflect upon the fact that you have your health, you just got a massive payday for fighting Canelo again, and you are a champion, and that you may call it a career at that point? Will that run through your mind at all?
Однозначно да, потому что я скажу так, наверное, во мне вот эта вот страсть к боксу еще пока не остыла. В данный момент у меня 3 пояса в 160, мне надо решать свои вопросы. Я думаю, даже скажу, может быть, немножко громко, я неплохо себя чувствовал, и если вы видели, я, в принципе, даже не пропускал, и не устал, то есть я показал, что есть силы, чему я очень рад. Где бы я бы ни находился, я, конечно, буду думать о том, как вернуться и с каким настроем.
So that was Gennadiy Golovkin, who was keen to remind everybody that he is still the unified middleweight champion, albeit losing up at 168 pounds. Doesn't seem to me, at least, to be somebody who's considering retirement anytime soon, Andy. Does that surprise you at all?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I kind of wish he would, but fighters generally tend to go on a bit longer than you want them to. They need to kind of rubber stamp it for themselves before they can see maybe what everybody else is seeing. But maybe he can beat Charlo still, who's the WBC champion. I mean, an absolutely massive fight would be him and Alim Kanuli in Kazakhstan.
Massive.
Yeah, I mean, that's whether you look at that as a fan and you just think, what a no-brainer, a 3-belt unification in Kazakhstan between 2 Kazakhs. It'd be absolutely huge because they're obsessed with boxing over there. But it's just whether they could generate the money to make it happen. I mean, you can argue that Golovkin doesn't really need the money anymore, but at the same time, no one gets in there for anything less than their market value.
Yeah,
that's just not realistic. It's not what happens, is it? But that would be amazing, to put those two on in a mega fight in Almaty or Astana it'd be terrific.
Who's your favourite in that fight?
I'm not sure, and that kind of suggests that there's some merit in it. I mean, he's a lot fresher, Alim Kanuli, than Golovkin, that's for sure. But at the same time, even at the weekend, you look at Golovkin, he never really looked in any particular trouble, did he? And he's boxing at 168. I wouldn't have thought it's going to be a big problem for him just to trim back down to 160. And he did recently win a world title unification at 160. So maybe he's still the best fighter at that weight. I do think that I am pretty interested in finding out, actually. I'm pretty interested in finding out. I'd probably still back him. I think I'd still back him.
He's certainly going to have, I think I saw a tweet about this, like he's still going to have the best win at 160 pounds coming the end of the year. Unless something spectacular happens between now and the end of the year and we see Charlo versus Alan Cannulli, which is not going to happen because boxing. So yeah, you make a good point there.
Eubank was piping up, wasn't he?
Yeah. There was an analogy that somebody told me once, but it's probably not suitable for this. But yeah, it was interesting to see him to pipe up and talk about potentially fighting him. Of course, he's still fighting Conor Benn, or is he? Or we don't really know what's going on with that. He is fighting Conor Benn. But yeah, Chris Eubank Jr. never short of a word or two at the opportune moments when everybody's got their eyes on Twitter. Oh, Chris Eubank tweets just popped up. Let's talk about Canelo. He won the fight at a canter, really. I had the fight 118, 110. Gave Golovkin a couple of rounds. I think if you're very, very, very generous to Golovkin, you could maybe give him 3 or 4 rounds. But a resounding, clear win for Canelo Alvarez. But as we kind of touched upon earlier, there isn't this kind of post-fight, Canelo's. There's no gushing and fawning over Canelo after this, is there?
No, there isn't. And he is in a slightly unfortunate position because whatever anybody says, he didn't control the scorecards in that first fight. That's just what happened. I think the second fight might be the kind of one which gets a little bit more forgotten in this trilogy, where he got the win, and I don't think it was wrong that he got the win. But off the back of Saturday, no one's getting overexcited, and he's in this place now where does he go? Who does he fight that's really going to get people's pulses racing? Because whilst he was cleaning out the super middleweight division, okay, some of those fights weren't, they didn't, exactly set the world on fire. But you knew what it was all about. He's trying to become undisputed, and that's a big thing. And he did it quick too. So that kind of that mission that he set himself, it was exciting, and it did catch the imagination. But now, light heavy's probably not the right thing for him. I think he realises that himself. Although being the kind of bloke he is, I'd imagine he would want to fight Bivol again at some point, or whoever it is who ends up getting all of those belts, if indeed that happens. But at super middle, Benavidez is the name that was thrown out, and that was the name you threw out last week, and it is the right one because you could sell that. There is something going for it, but he didn't seem too high on that, did he? And I do understand why to an extent, but what else is he going to do? I mean, I don't really see what else is he going to do.
I think for me, the Benavidez fight is the obvious fight. I think that's the one. Unless you're dragging people up or he's moving up, then at 168 pounds, David Morrell's not ready. No. I think in a few years' time, maybe, but at the minute, he's still very, very raw. There's not really anybody else at 168 pounds.
He's not interested in Andrade, is he?
Here's what Canelo Alvarez had to say after the fight against Gennadiy Golovkin about a potential bout with David Benavidez.
We know you have talked about the Bivol rematch next, but you've also said you hope Ramirez wins that fight. And if Ramirez wins that fight, you don't want to fight him because you're both Mexican. So at 68, the best fight looks like you and Benavidez. He's born in America. He's half Ecuadorian. So does he count as Mexican, or that fight can happen if in the future?
I don't know. Anything can happen,
But that won't be a reason why I can hold it up that he's Mexican. That
like when I guys, always I say this. You share that video and put whatever you want. When I say I don't want to fight Mexican, is because I represent Mexico, and that's why. But I don't care. I fight anybody. And I fight my entire life, anybody. What do you think? I don't want to fight with Juan Mexico or Benavidez. But look, I hear his dad talking a lot of shit. But look, he's accomplished nothing. One single champion, Anthony Dirrell. Please. Don't disrespect myself. Please, guys.
So that was Canelo Alvarez, said that he's willing to fight anybody. This whole kind of Mexican line that's being drawn and stuff. He's basically said, look, I'm representing Mexico. It's what I want to do. But if it's a Mexican, if it's Benavidez or if it's whoever, then I'll fight whoever. It certainly seems like throughout his career, I mean, sometimes hasn't always fought. Golovkin being the obvious example of not necessarily always fighting somebody at their absolute best. But he has got in there with Cotto, Lara, Trout, Mayweather, Golovkin, Plant, Saunders, Smith. I mean, like Jacobs, Kovalev. You can keep going and going and going. So you can't really imagine him turning down a fight like that. But he doesn't seem too turned on by the David Benavidez fight.
No, I don't think he is. And I think that's going to be the problem he's potentially going to have going forward, because he does want to keep boxing. He's been pretty clear about that. And why wouldn't he? Because there's an awful lot of money to be made still, and this is his life. This is what he's done forever, and the decision to stop doing it will be absolutely huge. And there's no reason to make that decision now off the back of a win in another massive fight at the weekend. But you've got to get something that flicks that switch that gets you wanting to train and wanting to keep living this pretty hard life that they all have to live, no matter how much money they've got. The motivation has got to be there, and if the challenges aren't there to really get into his head and take him to that place, that they all talk about when you need to prepare to fight and go into battle and all that kind of stuff, then the end can begin to loom, and they can start to think about life after boxing. And as soon as you start to think about it, then it becomes that much nearer, I think. So for his own longevity, he needs to get excited about Benavidez, I think, somehow. Because otherwise, there isn't really that much else for him to do, as you said before.
Yeah, I think he spoke again in the post-fight press conference about injuries. He said he had a hand injury. I know that he'd had some other injuries. I mean, he had some knee injuries in between the second Golovkin fight and now. He said that the last time that he ran was before the Golovkin rematch, and he's only just ran for this camp because he had injuries with his knees. I know he had a shoulder problem before he boxed Dmitry Bivol. So he's getting to that stage now. He's had 62 pro fights. We spoke about this before, again, on the preview show, about have we seen the best of him? Have we seen his peak? I think we've definitely seen his peak physically. It's just his style over the years has changed, where I think he can kind of mask it a little bit better. He's not like the volume puncher, volume combination puncher that he was at 54 and at times at 60. So he's kind of been able to mask it a little bit. But I think if he's going to take this time out, which he seems like he's going to, I know there was talk about him boxing in December and what have you, but it looks as though that he's going to take a little bit of time. And by the way, I think he absolutely deserves it.
Yeah, me too.
He's had that period of time during the pandemic where he's kind of, I mean, Barry's spoken about it in the past about, carried boxing.
Yeah, he did.
He was prominent in big events at a time where there was no events at all really in boxing, and he unified the super middleweight division in 11 months or something like that, which is just remarkable given the current. I mean, obviously he has the money to do it, so it's not, as we discussed before, but if he is going to take that time out, the issue that I have with the timeout, what happens to the belts? Because he holds all the belts. We all know how difficult it is to hold all of the belts and not be beset upon by mandatories and governing bodies. Because he's Canelo, because he is the biggest draw in the sport, and certainly one of the biggest draws in the sport, he will be afforded a luxury with the mandatories and with the governing bodies that another fighter is not going to be able to be afforded. So what happens if he decides to stay out and then box, let's say, Dmitry Bivol in May of next year? What happens to those super middleweight belts? Because you've got, I mean, we've mentioned David Benavidez, who's still somewhat unbeaten, two-time WBC champion, but also now holds the interim belt. The WBC mandatory was fulfilled with Avni Yildirim, a worthy mandatory challenger as he was. When was that? It was about 15, 16 months ago. So, I mean, technically that's due. Then you've got Morrell's got the WBA regular. So I guess that could be due and called at some point. What happens to the super middleweight belts if Canelo decides to take a year out and then box at light heavyweight? That's my only problem with, I mean, have the break. He absolutely deserves the break, but you can't hold up the rest of the division just because you're Canelo.
No, I mean, the common sense thing would be for them to all get together and have a chat and agree that he should just vacate them all, because he's bigger than belts now. He has been for a while, and he wanted to become undisputed because, I mean, a lot more people have done that recently than did in the first 10 or 15 years. Everybody talks about the 4-belt era, and I know what they mean by it, but, you know, when you had one champion, whoever was champion was the undisputed champion. Yeah. Let's not go down that rabbit hole. But that's something he wanted to achieve, and he's done it. And nobody's in any doubt as to who the man is at 168 pounds. So he does deserve a break. But you know, you can rubber stamp your standing almost as the kind of grand imperator of the sport by bequeathing these belts to other people, by vacating them and saying, listen, you know, I achieved that mission. I did it in double quick time. I set a standard there. I showed every big fighter out there that you have the power, and if you want to do something like that or attempt it, you can. You know, I showed you all of that. You know, you can take that lofty position.
And he defended it as well. He defended the undisputed title.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, the sanctioning bodies can put the system in place with, you know, champion of recess or emeritus or whatever you want to call it, that when he comes back and decides he wants to fight at 168 again, then if you've got a belt, you've got to fight him.
Yeah, I mean,
and there's nothing wrong with that.
And also, it's not like the governing bodies are going to say, well, Canelo, you got to go back to number 16 now. You got to work your way up into the rankings.
No, I don't think they're going to put him in a series of eliminators.
No. Yeah, he's the ultimate mandatory. He brings the money. Money is the mandatory challenger, no matter what weight class you're in. Before we move on and talk about what's coming up this weekend, it would allow as well that those kind of, I mean, you've got Plant, you've got Benavidez. Okay, let's say Canelo sits out for a year. Plant and Benavidez should be fighting. Why is that fight not happening? They're both at PBC. That's a great fight. There's been so much talk between two camps over the last 12, 18, 24 months. I think like Caleb Plant also had like a run-in in the gym with like the Benavidez family. That seems to be a natural fight. But we spoke about this where we had like even Errol Spence was like floated as a name for Canelo. You had Errol Spence, like the welterweight champion, unified welterweight champion, and Alexander Usyk, the unified heavyweight champion, and literally every fighter and every weight class in between in this kind of Canelo sweepstakes. If Canelo needs to take a year out and kind of work on his injuries and what have you, do what he wants, sit on a beach in Mexico somewhere, do whatever, then these guys at 160, 68, I mean 75 slightly different, they need to be fighting each other rather than waiting around fighting these kind of tune-up fights and marking time fights, waiting for Canelo Alvarez to knock on their door and say, here's $10 million to fight me.
Yeah, exactly. And that could make for a really good, vibrant, entertaining scene. Because the good thing about having 4 belts is that you get a lot of world title fights. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe 4's one too many, or people will have their own thoughts on it. But the people who kind of don't like that system and talk forever about having one true champion, and they seem to have this idea that back in those days, those were halcyon days where everybody who deserved their shot got it, and that just isn't true.
No.
With 4 belts, you get a lot of world title fights. You get unifications, which we all love. I do anyway. And particularly recently, you get fights for undisputed. So it would be great to have a situation where, as I say, you know, the top man in the sport, which is him, vacates those belts and everybody else just gets to it, just goes at it. And that fight, you said, Caleb Plant Benavidez, it's madness that hasn't. That they can't make that happen.
And if you're Benavidez,
he said himself on Twitter the other day, Benavidez, didn't he? It's just like, what is going on with this? Because, you know, this is some I can't remember what he said exactly, but you know, this is some proper bullshit.
Yeah, and he said he's making us all look like bitches. I think he said, that's what he said, making us all look like bitches. But for Benavidez as well, he can say, okay, Canelo, I don't think he necessarily struggled, but I don't think he performed his best against Caleb Plant. Plant, you know, to his credit, made things difficult for Canelo in there. But if Benavidez goes and blows Plant away in 3 or 4 rounds, jumps on the microphone, this is what I did to him this way.
There you go.
And then if you're Caleb Plant, you go and beat David Benavidez, you didn't want to fight him, I've beaten him, and that seems like such a natural crucial fight to make. But yeah, it remains to be seen whether or not that happens. Okay, so this weekend we have a double bill in the UK. We have the heavyweights and we have the lightweights now. Sorry, I was just remembering who was headlining the card in Nottingham. Before we get over and into business, let's hear from Joe Joyce. Of course, the A side. It's Joyce-Parker ahead of his bout with Joseph Parker this weekend in Manchester. I spoke to Salas over there and he said to me that it was really beneficial for you to get the Hammer fight in because you'd had a little bit of a layoff and now it prepares you to go into the Parker fight. He said, though, that Parker was a much higher level. He said it's the most difficult opponent of your career. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, he's been to the top of the mountain being a ex-WBO champion, world champion, so he's very skillful and has been in the game a long time, so it's going to be the most, because he's the most rounded, he's got a bit of everything. He's very skillful. He can punch a bit. He can take a shot. Like, it's going to be a hard fight.
Have you noticed any difference with him? Obviously, with Andy Lee now, he was with Kevin Barry, somebody that I know that you would have run into in your time in Las Vegas, I'm sure. Have you noticed any difference in Joe Parker under Andy Lee?
Well, I saw the Chisora fight, which was his last performance, which was good. He looked strong, and gave Chisora some damaging punches and that, and he seemed like bigger in size, and I think now I actually heard an interview where he said that he's now doing it for himself now instead of like before where he would have got the world title. He was going for it for his coach and that, but now he's doing it for himself.
So that was Joe Joyce, big juggernaut, big fan of Joe Joyce in the ring and outside the ring. I think he's probably one of the most low-key, hilarious people in boxing. I think he's certainly, I'm certainly on Team Jugger, of course, impartially, of course. But yeah, he says there that Joseph Parker, he expects him to be the most difficult test of his career so far. You agree with that statement, Andy?
Yeah, I think Joyce's career has been really well driven and well managed so far, right from the beginning, going into that 10-rounder against Ian Lewison, which is about 5 years ago now, isn't it? Almost exactly, actually.
At the O2 Indigo, that was awful place to watch boxing, by the way. Wow.
Yeah, I was over in Belfast. I think Ryan Burnett was fighting the next night, but what they've done with him, I think, has been absolutely the right thing. The fight against Dubois came along at the ideal time. When you're his age, and he was 37, I think, yesterday or today, or this week at some point, you can't really afford many setbacks. You haven't really got time for that. So that was an absolute must-win against Dubois, and he did win, and he won handily, as we all know. And people do seem to forget the way he went about it that night, because since then, against Takam and Hammer, he has gone very much down the route of, you can hit me as much as you want, it's not going to make any difference, and eventually I will run you over. And people seem to think now that that is how he's going to do things going forward. And it might be, but it also might not, because he showed against Dubois that there's more to him than that. He's an Olympic silver medalist, a World Championship bronze medalist. He had a terrific record in WSB. He can do it another way. And I'll be really interested to see what he tries to do against Parker, because Parker, I think, is better now than when he was world champion. He said that the other day, didn't he? He's definitely improved with Andy Lee, because he did used to drift in fights. He drifted against Dillian White. I think he was kind of a little bit concussed early on in that fight from the knockdown, which was a clash of heads, basically. And the middle rounds, he went missing a bit. But in that first fight against Chisora, I was ringside for that. He did the same thing there. And he won because he kind of put it together when he needed to put it together.
To really tough it out in that second.
Yeah, but I remember watching it and just thinking, this doesn't really need to be like this by the look of it. And Andy in the corner was kind of saying, you need to... I think I remember at one point Andy basically saying, you've got to can you just get back in the room and just do what I know you can do? And he did, and he won. But he did it much more in the second fight. And yeah, I like the way they're kind of measuring up in the build-up too, because there is that respect there. They are two pretty entertaining, low-key, dry guys. And Parker's not intimidated by the big juggernaut, absolutely not. Joyce, for his part, I think he understands that you always wait until you get in there because you don't really know how hard somebody hits. And if Joyce feels like, oh, actually, you know what, I can run you over, then he will, because he'll take that route one approach. But I think this might be a little bit more cagey than people are are expecting it to be. But I still think it will be good.
Yeah, I don't really see how it can be a sort of a dud fight, really. I think there's, no matter what way they go about it, if Joyce decides to get behind that jab, which he did against Daniel Dubois, very long jab, and he varied the jab really well to the head and body as well of Dubois in that fight, then I can still see that being a good fight, because I think Parker's got the speed advantage, got good variety in his shot, good skill set. I can see it being a good boxing match. And also, if he tries to make Parker fight, which I think is probably going to be it's going to be a mixture of the two. I can see him get behind the jab, but also trying to make Parker work. We've seen Parker in the past against Chisora, and you've mentioned it there, go drifting through fights and go missing a little bit.
Yeah.
Not always fighting the full 3 minutes of every round. If you're in with Joe Joyce, he's going to make you fight. He's going to make you fight every minute or every second of every minute of every round in there. That's going to be the interesting thing for me with Joseph Parker. We went to see him a few weeks ago in Morecambe, and one of the things that I was really taken by was just how big he was. He looked in tremendous shape. I spoke to Andy Lee and the guys there, and they said, look, they've got a chef for the first time. Like, he has somebody doing all of his meals for him, and they wanted to make him a heavyweight, but keep the speed and keep the kind of the punch variety that he's been known for earlier in his career. Whether or not that's to counteract the juggernaut himself across the ring from him or not, who knows? But I think Parker's going to go out there. I feel like he's going to let his hands go. I feel like it's going to be a pretty good fight to watch. I don't see Andy Lee, he's a very offensive coach. That's what he's kind of been preaching to him, particularly for the Derek Chisora fight. The second Chisora fight, I thought he was very good offensively, Parker. Still had those moments where he did kind of drift through rounds. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to the fight, and I do expect Parker to have a significant speed advantage early in the fight. It's just whether or not he can keep that up for the 12 rounds against Joe Joyce. If he can't budge Joyce, and look, I fail to believe that any man can be knocked out, particularly at heavyweight. Joyce has obviously a granite chin, and he's a tremendous work rate, but when you get hit as clean as he gets hit, Takam, Hammer, Bryant Jennings had him hurt to the body in the first round of their fight a few years back. You can go. And I feel like from Andy Lee's perspective and Joseph Parker's perspective, Andy said something, he didn't say it to me, I can't remember what interview he said it, where he said that Emmanuel Stewart would always tell him, test a man in the first 30 seconds. See what he's got in the first 30 seconds. Let a big shot go. See how he reacts. And I can see something like that. I can see the first 2 or 3 rounds. I mean, this is probably going to come back and haunt me, but I can see the first 2 or 3 rounds of Joyce-Parker being an absolute firefight. I reckon they're just going to go like that, I think, in the first 3 rounds.
Yeah, this is what's really interesting about it, is that all sorts of things could happen. I think that Joyce might start a little bit more slowly than previously and in slightly more circumspect fashion, but that doesn't mean that Parker will. And I agree with that, because what you just said there, because there's no way, if you're a heavyweight and you've been a world champion and you're the size that Parker is, and he's not renowned as a huge puncher, but everybody in that division, as we know, can
He's a
punch.
sharp puncher.
He's a sharp puncher, exactly. There's no way their game plan is, okay, we're going to have to go the distance here. There's no way we can stop this guy. We're going to have to box and move and plant our feet when we need to and do all of these things. The plan to be able to do that will also be there, because they might find out, actually, you know what, I don't think we can stop this guy, but they will have to test that chin out. They'll have to. And I think they may well look to try and do it early, like you said. Let's go out there and let's see what this much vaunted chin is all about, because there is nobody who won't go, like you said, if they're caught clean often enough. Nobody is invulnerable or invincible in there. That's just... anyone who thinks that has gone completely crazy. There are just so many ways it could play out, and that's what makes it really, really interesting. And Joyce, like I said, I do think that he kind of plays up to this idea of the big juggernaut, the immovable object, the irresistible force. It doesn't matter how hard you hit me, like the Terminator, I'll just kind of like flicker and then reboot. But he's smarter than that. He is definitely smarter than that. But having said that, if Parker steps into the middle of the ring and does let his hands go, he's not going to be able to resist it.
No
way.
And that's kind of where I think it goes. I think even if Joyce gets behind the jab early, I think Parker is quick enough that he'll be looking to counter. Like the jab that Joyce threw against Daniel Dubois was obviously very, very effective. Joseph Parker much more experienced, certainly on the big stage. I feel like that was one of the issues for Daniel Dubois in that. I think the lack of senior amateur experience kind of reared its ugly head down the line when you fought a big, strong man who's not scared of getting hit. But also I felt like it was the occasion, admittedly kind of a strange one. It was behind closed doors, but it was a big, big fight on BT Sport, whereas Parker's been in there with Joshua. He's been in there with Dillian White. He's been in there with Andy Ruiz. Like, it was kind of a fight that people forget about all of those years ago for him winning the world title. So I feel like Parker is going to be able to be equipped early. It's just, for me, what happens after 6 rounds. If Joyce is still in there, he hasn't been hurt, and Parker's not shot his load, but has thrown a lot of heavy shots in those early rounds, then the second half of the fight, you'd favour Joe Joyce.
You would, absolutely. And it'd be at that point where Parker would really, people talk about biting down, but he would really have to bite down and dig deep. And that's not to say that he couldn't do it, because by halfway he might have built up a fairly handy lead. And yeah, it is just, it's a fascinating one. I'm really looking forward to it. I'm up there for TalkSport, and it's going to be a great fight to be ringside for, because these are two massive units, and you get a real idea of the force and the power in there. And he is different to anybody that Joyce has been in with before, Parker, because he is that much better. He's not the faded force. You could say that we still haven't seen the best of him, and maybe we're going to see the best of him on Saturday. You look at Takam and Hammer, and okay, against Takam, I think we had him losing pretty much every round until the stoppage, to be honest. But you knew that it was just that classic case of Takam was desperately managing to win some battles, but he wasn't winning the war. No way was he winning the war. I mean, it was just, he was so far. It makes me laugh when people say, oh, well, he won every round up until that point, but he got stopped in the 6th round. Like, that's not touching distance from the tape, is it? Like, you're miles out. But with Parker, that second half of the fight could be could be so gripping if he has given it a shot in the first half and thought, actually, okay, this guy, I don't think this is going to happen. Joyce, for his part, has thought in that first half, okay, like, this guy's a bit different. I can't take any liberties here. Let's not take too many. All right, I'm losing some rounds here, but let's not panic about that. And then he's got a deficit to reel back in the second half, and Parker's having to, you know, dig in and try and keep that lead. You know, that could be brilliant. That could be really tremendous.
So let's hear from Joseph Parker, of course, former WBO heavyweight champion, about his preparations for Saturday night against Joe Joyce.
And I got the gym set up here, camp set up. Tyson's been very generous in giving us his gym to use. Nice big house to rent for the camp, and his whole team. You know, so I'm here with Andy, chef, brother flying in, got my parents coming fight week. They're all coming to Morecambe Bay. This is the most difficult fight. I mean, Joyce is one of those fighters that people don't want to fight, and he's been avoided because he's very dangerous. You know, and we could see with what he's done with his opponents. You know, he just chases them down, big engine, you know, pressure, throws a lot of punches, and a lot of people don't like to deal with that, but I do. I love a challenge.
Outside, boom, that's there, and you got to get over that shoulder, so it's got to be there, and then and shoulder to knee. Okay. Boom. That. You got to get over that shoulder.
So that was Joseph Parker. All systems go, ready to go against Joe Joyce this weekend. Very confident. We'd mentioned, I think I tweeted about it, and I spoke to our colleagues on the day of the shoot, that I don't know whether it's been around Fury for as long as he's been around him, Andy Lee kind of making that mental change for him, but he seems quite different now, Parker, for me. You know, we've kind of covered him for a long time now, and been out to him in Vegas with Kevin Barry, and, you know, seen him over the last 12 to 18 months with Andy Lee and Tyson Fury. They have that kind of, that Spartan sort of guerrilla mentality while they're in the gym with Fury, and it seems like it, on the surface at least, like it's just clicking for him, and he seems in a better place both physically and mentally than I've seen him in the past.
Sometimes you just need a change, don't you? They were very tight, him and Kevin Barry, and as far as I'm aware, that relationship ended on good terms, because he just needed something. He needed something new, a change of scene, a change of voice, a change of everything, really. And being around someone like Fury is definitely a good thing, because you see how he goes about it. You see the kind of the drive and determination that he's got every single day to train like a demon and just stay on the stay at the pinnacle of the sport. And Andy as well is someone who still pretty early in his training career, and he was always somebody who people picked out as being the kind of person that you would fancy to be a good trainer, because he worked under Emmanuel Stewart and Adam Booth, and he's obviously a real kind of thinker. People loved his analysis in the media and things like that. So I think when he became a trainer, I think he was actually weirdly or immediately under quite a lot of pressure to be a good trainer.
Yeah, I can see that.
So those two, I think, have found each other at kind of the perfect sort of time, because he probably wasn't really expecting it, Andy. In fact, I know he wasn't.
He was just looking to work with Paddy Donovan initially, wasn't he?
Yeah. And then all of a sudden now he's up towards the top of the heavyweight division, and I think they get on well as people as well, because Parker's he's a very amiable character. I loved it during lockdown when he did all those videos and stuff, because before that people probably, he was just that. He was an amiable character, but that just showed that there's something else there too. Like you said at the beginning, these are just two guys it's impossible not to really, really like. They're kind of everything that's really good about boxing. They give their lives to it. They train hard. They take what they do very seriously. They don't take themselves that seriously. The press conference at BET a few weeks ago was one of the weirdest and most entertaining ones I've been to, where you've got these two massive rock hard units quacking at each other. And you've got Frank arguing with Ben Shalom, or, and getting his phone out to show you text messages, and all the kinds of things that you want. And yeah, there's not going to be any histrionics during the build-up. There isn't. There's not going to be any pushing or shoving or anything like that, and it just doesn't need it. It just doesn't need it.
And they've both taken good fights as well. I mean, obviously different sort of situation for Joyce, turning over slightly later, but you kind of already rattled off who Parker's boxed as a pro, and certainly in kind of his world title years, or the most recent years in his career. Joe Joyce has kind of actively sought out the biggest challenges as he can, obviously a byproduct of turning over slightly later and one of those big fights. But yeah, no, I agree. I'm interested to see what the back and forth is like this week. I mean, we did it. I don't know why I still do it. I say, right, say into the camera what you're going to do. And it's more funny than intimidating, really.
Yeah.
But I saw the face-off that they did with Frampton, and he just kind of, they're both so likable. Frampton's likable, and he's kind of looking at it thinking like, oh, this is great, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah.
Does that translate into pay-per-view buys? I'm not sure, but we'll see. We'll hopefully see sometime next week. Right, before we move on from that, we all love an interim belt, don't we? The WBO Interim heavyweight title at stake on Saturday night between Joe Joyce and Joseph Parker. Joe Joyce told us earlier on a couple of weeks ago that, early next year he wants to fight Alexander Usyk. WBO interim title, Andy, are you a fan?
Well, all it really means, I think, doesn't it, is that if we have a situation where the WBO end up stripping their champion, or their champion vacates, that whoever wins this will just get promoted. I don't think they would then have to fight for it. I think whoever wins would then just get elevated to full champion. But I think the idea that whoever wins this will fight Usyk early next year is pretty fanciful, to be honest, because that's not going to happen. I don't think. He's got 3 belts, and he was the WBO mandatory challenger himself. So if you're going to go around on the kind of carousel,
the WBA
would be up next year, because that was Povetkin, wasn't it? And then Pulev with the IBF. So they would be. It doesn't always work like that, but they would be in for quite a long wait, and that's the problem you've got when all 4 belts are occupied by 2 fighters, and we've had that situation for a really long time now. The identities have changed, but it's always been that breakdown, hasn't it? So I don't know if you're these guys, I don't think you can get too hung up on what happens after this. Well, we know what will happen after this if Parker wins. There'll be a rematch.
Yeah.
On December the 17th.
17th, yeah. On Sky.
Yeah, exactly, on Sky Box Office. So for Parker, it's kind of, I remember saying this to him at the presser a few weeks ago. We just had a quick chat off the record, and I said, well, it's kind of straightforward for you, isn't it? In your head, you're fighting Joe Joyce twice in the next few months. And he just said, yeah, that's what's happening. But beyond that, I mean, I really don't know.
I think it's political posturing. I think from the on the Joyce side of things, and you know, we all know that Frank Warren has a very good relationship with the WBO over the years. You know, they could say, you know, we want to fight Alexander Usyk next. Oh, Usyk's going to fight so and so, strip him, or he needs to vacate. I mean,
Put some pressure on, aren't you?
Yeah, exactly. When it's like when you're fighting for the mandatory slot, that's one thing. When you're fighting for an interim belt, it is slightly different, and that does imply some political pressure being put on somewhere along the line. And look, it happens as much as we talk about kind of waiting a year and doing this. I mean, Fury was stripped by the IBF after 9 days or something, wasn't it? Like when he beat Vladimir Klitschko. So governing bodies, as always, will do what works best for them from a business standpoint. So that is Manchester. We don't have enough time, unfortunately, to run through the undercards, but we do have time to talk about Nottingham, which is, of course, now Kid Galahad versus Maxi Hughes after Lee Wood versus Mauricio Lara was postponed. We caught up with Eddie Hearn. Here's what he had to say about Lee Wood withdrawing from his bout with Mauricio Lara due to injury.
Mauricio Lara, Lee Wood is no longer. I'm just kind of get your update.
I mean, we had about 300 tickets left for that fight, and you know, Lee Wood done his bicep. He's going to be out for about 4 to 6 weeks, and we had a call to make. You know, we've got all these fighters who rely on fighting to get paid. We've still got a great card. Maxi Hughes against Galahad, Rankin against Harper, 2 great fights at the top of the bill. And I made the decision to go ahead. We owe it to the fighters. You know, the zone back our fighters to make sure we can get out. It's still a great night. If you bought a ticket, you're entitled to a refund, but come along, it's a great night of boxing, and we'll look to reschedule Wood v Lara.
So that was Eddie Hearn, I think, sharing everybody's thoughts that it's, you know, it's a real shame that we don't get to see Lee Wood versus Mauricio Lara. It's kind of one of those fights that, you know, boxing rarely throws up. A fight that, certainly from my perspective, I don't know if you feel the same, looking at it, you thought, Lee Wood's going to fight Mauricio Lara. Okay, great fight, but surprised by that one.
Yeah, I was. It, in a good way. Not that surprised when you think about the Lee Wood himself and the kind of fighter he is, because what's happened to him over the last few years it's one of my favourite stories, actually, because I remember commentating on his Commonwealth title fight against Abraham Bonsu in Peterborough that would have been like early 2019, I think. And that had come off the back of a period of intense stagnation, shall we say, in his career, where just nothing was happening for him at all. And then all of a sudden it started to happen. He won a British title, but then he lost in the golden contract, and it was after that I think he won the British title. Then he gets the fight for the world title against Kanju and wins, and he's been amazing.
Had that amazing fight with Michael Conlan.
Yeah, and that incredible fight with Michael Conlan, homecoming in Nottingham. It's what a story, and he got properly paid for that too, which is great. And then decides, all right, okay, yeah, fine, I'll have it with Mauricio Lara, and we all know about him. So, although it wouldn't strike you as being necessarily the wisest thing to do, he obviously felt that he was going to win that fight and it was going to be good to watch, and then he would just kick on from there. So it's a shame that it's not happening. It is a big shame that it's not happening. I know Conlan feels that Wood doesn't really want that rematch. They've been chasing that quite hard, but it doesn't look like they'll get it.
It seems to me like, I mean, I'm sure you'll agree, it seems to me like that's a fight that can always happen. Like Wood Conlan too, because of how good the first fight was. Yeah, that can always happen. Lee Wood, of course, spoke very openly about wanting to fight either Ray Vargas or Leo Santa Cruz. Yeah. The WBA kind of did their thing of, okay, yeah, we'll order it, but we'll order it at a purse split that doesn't make any sense for you, so you're not going to take the fight. No. Which, of course, works. Again, what we were talking about earlier works for PBC. They get to make Ray Vargas versus Leo Santa Cruz, which, of course, is a big fight in America. Keeps everything kind of nice and tight over there, a unification between the WBC and the WBA Super. Josh Warrington, who we'll discuss shortly, has his IBF mandatory against Luis Alberto Lopez. Really hard fight, but after vacating a title already, you can't see him doing that again. So it kind of left Wood with Mauricio Lara, Michael Conlan rematch, and then, you know, with respect, some fighters who are not going to be giving him the paycheck that he feels that he'll deserve, particularly on the run of his last few fights. So, yeah, very interesting fight that we hope that we still get to see, but I don't know. I don't know if we're going to see that fight now. Hopefully they can reschedule it and we can get it on again at some other point. Before we move on, we talk about the actual card that is happening. Josh Warrington, we briefly discussed him off camera a short while ago. Looks as though he'll be fighting Bernardo Lopez. We've seen him over here beat Isaac Lowe, Tyson Fury's trainer, at York Hall. I think it was at York Hall a few months back now. That's a hard fight for Josh Warrington, and a fight that if he comes unstuck in that fight, and let's say Lee Wood boxes Mauricio Lara and comes unstuck in that, then Wood versus Warrington, which could be a big fight, certainly in the UK, maybe falls by the wayside. But yeah, not an easy mandatory for Josh Warrington.
No, it isn't. And I really, really hope he gets through it, because COVID was a complete disaster for Warrington. He came back to Matchroom, like you say. He then vacated that IBF title because there were problems with making that fight against Kanji, weren't there? And then everything just went haywire from there. There was the defeat against Lara, and I was there for that, and it was brutal. And I remember just looking at him that night as he was being led out of the ring or leaving the ring, and just thinking to myself, this is not a scenario that anyone would ever have envisaged with a global pandemic, obviously, but this so was not what was supposed to happen. And then the rematch obviously ended early, and even that, great occasion though it was, being outdoors in a stadium, it just was very kind of unsatisfactory.
Massive anticlimax.
And yeah, huge anticlimax. And he's got the title back. And now I would just love to see him have one more really big one, because I don't think he would necessarily want to keep boxing for that much longer. I don't know that. I've not spoken to him about it, but you know, he's given an awful lot to his career. He's been very, very dedicated. He's had a lot of pressure on his shoulders because he's been headlining for such a long time. It's a great story, Josh's story as well. It's one of my favourite ones in terms of how someone has just taken their career step by step by step, never got ahead of themselves, never listened to the criticism, never listened to the criticism of his trainer, also his dad, obviously. They're a very tight unit. I just think he's a brilliant example of how you do things. He's done everything right. And if he could just get one more big one in, I think that would be enough. But he's got to beat Lopez first if that's going to happen. It would just be a bad way to not necessarily finish, because were he to lose that fight, I'm sure that he would.
There'd still be options for him.
But
yeah.
I'd just love to see him win that fight and then have one more big one.
Got to be Vegas for him, hasn't it? Like there's a handful of fighters over the last 15, 20 years, or even longer than that, in the UK that can take a travelling army.
Yeah.
He's one of them. He's probably the only one that's, I mean, okay, Fury and Joshua, it's a different type of, you have the more casual fans who will travel over for that. He will take 5,000 mental Leeds fans.
The same ones.
Yeah.
The same ones who have been there.
Exactly. Yeah. And I feel like he can go and do that. I know that the Lee Wood fight was something that has been offered to him, and of course for Matchroom and DAZN, that makes a lot of sense. But I think for him, and I know this, he told me this himself, going over to box somebody like a Leo Santa Cruz or a Ray Vargas over in Vegas and taking an army with him, that's what he wants to do. Yeah. He's had the domestics, and look, he beat Lee Selby at Elland Road.
Doesn't get any better than
Exactly. Beat Carl Frampton after that in Manchester, another brilliant fight, another big name on his resume. The only thing really missing for Warrington, okay, like people talk about two-weight world champion, he could have moved up to super feather, I'm sure. But that big away day, that big away trip is the only thing that's missing from, as you've mentioned, a brilliant career, and one that's, I don't think anybody could have foreseen his career going the way that it's gone, for good and bad, but largely good over the last 10 years or so. That would be the perfect sign-off for somebody like Josh Warrington.
Yeah, it would, and I really do think he deserves it.
Yeah.
Because if you work along the lines of, I deserve this, I'm owed that, then you're always going to end up being disappointed, really, in whatever walk of life you're in. But he's not one of those characters. He knows that boxing is fickle. He knows that elite level sport, the dividing lines are very, very fine at times. But you look at the 2018 he had, and that win at Elland Road against Selby, and then the win against Frampton at the Manchester Arena, they were just two massive fights and huge performances. And then 2019, Galahad, and then Takust, which was his first kind of soft fight, if you like, but still a world title defense. He was ticking over, and the bomb was supposed to explode in 2020. And like I said before, we all know what happened. I would love to see him do that, go to Las Vegas, because, like you say, it is different with Fury and Joshua, because when you're a big name from the start, people want to go and see you because it's kind of an occasion.
Yeah.
That's what they're there for. But with someone like Warrington, like you say, like with Hatton, like Warrington, we scrabbled around selling tickets when he was on his way up. He turned pro to absolutely no fanfare. Steve Wood almost actually tried to persuade him not to do it. His manager, he won an English title away in Dudley, Commonwealth title away in Hull, and it was only at that point that they said, right, well, we'll put you on the leads now. They almost were forced into it because he won that fight for the Commonwealth in Hull that he wasn't really supposed to win, or that wasn't Matchroom's plan anyway, and it all grew from there. So yeah, everybody who's been on that train since then, really, they're the ones who want to go to Las Vegas. But probably particularly now more than ever after what's happened over the last 2.5 years, and that would be, what a great way to win, lose or draw there. What a great way to finish that could be for him.
Absolutely. So we are now left with, of course, Maxi Hughes versus Kid Galahad. I felt like it was the type of fight that was a very solid co-main. Now it's been elevated to the main event. It's nobody's fault. The main event was a great fight that everybody was looking forward to. Galahad versus Maxi Hughes, my big concerns about that is the styles. I feel like that's a fight that doesn't have Wood-Lara levels of barnstormingness about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, Maxi Hughes, sort of ironically, given that he's Josh's stablemate, everything went right for him during COVID, as it was all kind of deteriorating for Josh. Maxi was flying after that win against John O'Carroll. Everything's just rolled on from there, and it's been brilliant to see, because there are certain fighters who you feel like they're never quite going to get there, or they're never quite going to get what they deserve. And then when it happens, you just love it, don't you? Remember, like from a similar part of the world, Josh Whale just loved it when he finally won his British title. Because you just thought, there's someone who is just giving it absolutely everything, and just with a little bit more luck, it could have happened, and you think it's not going to happen, and then it does happen, and we all get high on those stories, and rightly, because you do just literally love to see it. And he's really confident going into this fight, Maxi. Kid Galahad's been taken a bit by surprise by how confident he is, but it is interesting that he's gone straight from featherweight to lightweight, isn't it? In the same way that Selby did, actually, who we were talking about a few minutes ago, missing out super feather. I don't know whether that's a good thing or not. It certainly suggests that he hung around at featherweight too long, but at the same time, that's quite a big leap, 9 pounds. And with Galahad, whenever you spoke to anyone about him, whether they'd shared the ring in sparring or on the night, what they always talked about was how incredibly strong and kind of unpleasantly strong he is. Like in the clinch, up close. Didn't necessarily translate into him being a massive puncher, but certainly a good sharp puncher. Whether he'll still have that at 135 pounds, Maxi Hughes clearly thinks he won't. And Galahad's a little bit kind of bemused by it, but
seems a bit offended, doesn't he? By
he does, because he does, but yeah, without wishing to, you never want to write a fight off before it's actually happened. But you look at this one and you're kind of hoping that it surprises you, because your instant reaction to it is that it could be pretty gritty rather than, the kind of entertainment we expected from, as you said, from Wood against Lara.
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you've said. Kid Galahad, obviously making his first appearance since being brutally knocked out by Kiko Martinez.
Yeah.
That has to be a difficult one to come back from. He's, by his own admission, you mentioned the Josh Warrington fight earlier, a lot of people had him winning that fight. Yeah, he kind of had to go about things, a different way. He was, of course, had his drugs ban earlier in his career, so that didn't help matters with him getting the opportunities that he would have felt that he deserved. Finally get to the top of the mountain, and people are talking about unification fights. You have a voluntary against Kiko Martinez, a fighter who, while Kiko is a kind of one of our favourite away fighters, I guess we would say over the years, he is still, somebody who's been an away fighter in those big events over here. fight was going pretty much to plan for the first 3 or 4 rounds, and then I remember Darren Barker, one of the best bits of commentary, just saying, yeah, he's just leaving that chin up in the air when he's pulling out, and then I think it was 4 minutes or so later, got caught with that right hand, and then the fight was over. That has to be a difficult one to come back from. He kind of styled himself, Galahad, in his career as the anti-hero.
Yeah.
And, I'm just me, I'm going to smash him, I'm going to destroy him. And that's all very well and good, you doing that when you're winning. When you lose, and in the fashion that he lost his title, that air of invincibility for himself goes. And then you've also got people tuning into, who tuned in to watch him lose, finally see him lose, and then they stop caring and they're not interested anymore. So it's going to be very interesting. I mean, Maxi Hughes not a big puncher, but probably punches hard enough. And it's lightweight. It's a different weight. You can spar all the lightweights you want, but until you get in there and you get hit with 8-ounce gloves on the back of a knockout like that, you don't know how you're going to react. So I'm interested to see the outcome of the fight. I'm not massively intrigued by the fight. I do feel like it's going to be a clash of styles. I hope it surprises us, and I hope there's knockdowns galore, and it's the lightweight Hagler Hearns and what have you. I can't really see that.
But it's massive for Galahad. I mean, it's absolutely...
Yeah, if he loses that... I mean, if Maxi Hughes loses on the back of the run that he's had, picking up the British title, and he's been mentioned as an opponent for Ryan Garcia and stuff like that, which you'd have just thought was absolute crazy talk a couple of years ago, then he just goes back to a level whereby he can compete and rebuild again. Galahad loses back-to-back fights, like Kiko Martinez by stoppage, and then loses to Maxi Hughes. You really have to wonder where he goes.
Yeah, you do. And I'd imagine what he probably might do would decide that lightweight was too far and try and go back down to super featherweight. But as for the loss against Martinez, it is a fascinating subject, how boxers explain defeats to themselves and manage to compartmentalise it, kind of seal it off and move on. And with him, it'll be the weight, won't it? He'll say, well, it was the weight. That can't happen to me at lightweight. I hung around at featherweight just a little bit too long, and I knew it really in the back of my mind, but I'd won the title. I wanted that first defence, and with the benefit of hindsight, it was the wrong thing to do. And that's what that's how he'll have done it, because you do need to explain it to yourself.
We've spoken about it.
Yeah, exactly, and that's what he'll have done. But he absolutely has to win against Maxi Hughes, or it is difficult to see where he goes, because he is unpopular and he knows it. Like he did a really interesting podcast on Boxing Live Stories with Tris Dixon. If people haven't listened to it, give it a listen, because you might change your mind about him. He comes across really well on it as just being this very, very realistic, very focused, very dedicated athlete who understands why people don't like him, basically, because of the drugs ban, who understands the business of boxing and has always been very focused on getting to where he needed to get to, and he got there, and he wanted to stay there, but unfortunately it just didn't work out that way.
No, it certainly didn't. It looked as though on paper it looked like the perfect defence for him.
Yeah, I thought it was the people slated that fight when it was made, but I didn't see anything wrong with it. I thought as a first defence when you've just won the title.
And Martinez, of course, coming back off the back of the Zelfa Barrett fight, which a lot of people, myself included, felt he won.
Yeah,
up at super feather.
Didn't think there was anything wrong with it at all, and but people got stuck into it as a match. But this is what you do when you win the title. You take a home defence, obviously, first off, and it's a voluntary, and you get to choose. And there's just no way they anticipated it going wrong in the way that it did. It was a massive upset.
It certainly was. Okay, well, we've got a short bit of time left to discuss what comes before Saturday night, which is Friday night. Shakur Stevenson returns. Sorry, the coffee. Returns to defend his WBO super featherweight title titles, should I say, against Robson Conceicao. Obviously somebody that you will have known well through the amateurs as well. I felt like Robson Conceicao was very unfortunate not to be world champion himself against Oscar Valdez, but he is going in there with, in a lot of people's eyes, and certainly in my eyes, one of, if not the standout young talent in the sport in Shakur Stevenson.
Yeah, he is, and it's good to see him get the opportunity, be pushed back into that position again pretty quickly, because he was unlucky against Valdez, and I was really impressed with him against Valdez. He was a really good amateur. He's Olympic gold medalist, a couple of medals in World Championships, and that does speak for itself. But it doesn't always translate. And up until that point, he'd been moved pretty well, but he hadn't really boxed anyone, to be honest, before he got in with Valdez. And I didn't think it'd go that well for him. I thought that Valdez at that stage might find him out a bit.
He was coming off the back of that win over Miguel Berchelt.
Yeah, exactly. And it was exactly that kind of contest that Conceicao hadn't had, or hadn't even nearly had. And I thought Valdez might kind of run him over, to be honest with you.
He'd had the Ceja fight where he'd been dropped. He had the fight where he'd been dropped a couple of times, Conceicao, before then. So a lot of people were looking at that thinking like, Valdez on the back of this win over Miguel Berchelt, who Berchelt was the guy at super featherweight, and Valdez did a real number on him. We'll remember the knockout, but up until that point, he dropped him a couple of times. He hurt him with every shot that he hit him with, pretty much. It was a brilliant performance. But Conceicao just looked like he had his number on the night. That kind of well-schooled amateur style, kept his distance, and I felt like he won the fight clear. And I know that there was a lot of consternation on sort of the other side of the pond, should we say, that Valdez landed the bigger shots. Valdez landed this. I felt that Conceicao clearly won the fight. I felt
Conceicao won. I mean, I thought, he did win. He got the short end of the stick there, big time.
It was also in the build up to that as well. I think people have forgotten about Oscar Valdez with the fentanyl. He tested positive in the build up to that fight as well, but he promised, and he crossed his fingers and everything, and promised everybody that it wasn't a legitimate doping violation, so the fight went ahead. Funny old game. But yeah, back to the fight this Friday. Shakur Stevenson.
Back in Newark.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be interesting to see how he's built, because look, we all know how good he is, and he is fucking good.
Oh yeah.
But does it translate, that kind of master boxing style? You had the win over Jamel Herring. Okay, he stopped Jamel Herring, but it was kind of a strange stoppage where he was stopped on his feet and he wasn't really taking too much stick. The fight wasn't competitive, but I felt like Herring probably could have saw out the rounds if needs be. And he had that win over Oscar Valdez, which virtuoso, masterclass, whatever you want to call it. But ultimately, people want to see knockouts. And when you're anointed as the next Floyd Mayweather, you're anointed as the star of the future, that's what people want to see. So going to be interested to see what version of Shakur Stevenson turns up against Robson Conceicao. Does he try and become a little bit more fan-friendly, or does he stick to what's working for him so far? I sense he sticks to what's working so far, because I can't think of too many rounds, if any, off the top of my head, that he's lost in his career so far.
No, and also I do think that fight by fight he's still getting physically stronger, because he was 19, wasn't he, in Rio? That's 6 years ago, so he's 25 now, and he's always looked quite boyish. I mean, at 19 you are a boy, really, but you get some 19-year-olds who look like men.
Yeah.
So I think he is still filling out, and I think he's just going to kind of trust that process. I think that's maybe the plan. Is that why would you kind of ever abandon these kinds of skills? You're just giving away an advantage if you choose to fight a different way to try and crowd please more, although you do see people do it at times. He just is very, very good. And I really, really hope that it draws a good crowd, and that's something they can do with him more often than not, because it's great when you get someone who can sell out their local arena and you can take them back there. You look at Wilder, Crawford, and they're great nights, aren't they? You know, you go back in the day, like not that far back in the day, Kelly Pavlik, people like that, you know, Youngstown, and you go to like places that aren't necessarily big boxing destinations traditionally, but they become them because they've got their guy and they love their guy. And we were talking about Warrington, and it's more common in the UK, but obviously America's that much bigger.
Yeah.
You take them to the kind of meccas, don't you, of New York more often, or Las Vegas, or wherever it may be. Interestingly, I was reading the other day that Newark's got a big Brazilian population.
That's cool. That should be good.
So
then.
yeah, so that should make it quite good fun. But it you know, I struggle to see much of a future for Conceicao in this fight, to be honest. Just because he's up against somebody who skill-wise is better than him.
He might be he's certainly one of the most skilled fighters in the sport, I think, Shakur Stevenson. Going to be interesting to see what happens with him afterwards. I know they were talking about a Chris Colbert fight, and obviously over the other side of the street at PBC, and he's since lost to Hector Luis Garcia.
Yeah, that really wasn't supposed to happen, was it?
No, and in the fashion that it did as well, that was, I mean, talk about a damaging loss. The way that he lost that fight wasn't great. I mean, he kind of skated around the ring for the last 2 or 3 rounds to stop.
There was
to
another
not
one
get
that night,
out.
wasn't there? And Carhas lost that night.
Yeah, to Fernando Martinez. They're doing that rematch. I can't believe that rematch is happening.
Fair dues to
Fair play, yeah, fair play to Ancajas, because he got lit up in that fight.
Oh, he did, big time.
He almost got stopped 3, 4, 5 times in that fight. It was a brilliant performance from Fernando Martinez. Made me want to see Fernando Martinez versus Julio Cesar Martinez, a battle between 2 little mental Martinezes. But anyway, back to Shakur Stevenson. Seems intent on joining the party as well at 135 pounds. You've got, I mean, Ryan Garcia's last fight was at 140, but he's a lightweight. Devin Haney's boxing Cambosos. You've got Davis floating around. Shakur Stevenson's spoken openly in the past about wanting to box Vasily Lomachenko. That's a fight that I know you well enough at this point to know that you'd be very interested in seeing. But yeah, the future looks extremely bright for Shakur Stevenson. What fight? I mean, with all due respect to Robson Conceicao, I think we both feel that the fight is heavily sort of stacked in Shakur's favour. If he is successful against Conceicao, who would you like to see in box?
I mean, if he's ready to go up to lightweight, that's where the real heat is, isn't it?
Yeah.
That's where the real action is. So I think that's probably what I would like to see him do, because there's been a lot of chat around those lightweights. Everybody started talking about 4 new kings, didn't they, when Teofimo Lopez beat Lomachenko, and that just hasn't really materialised. Like, none of them have fought each other at all, have they? The names that they were talking about.
I've had lots of photos together, and they've sent a lot of tweets and things like that.
There's been loads of that, but not much else. I think the fight I would most like to see him in is probably Davis. Gervonta Davis.
Yeah, that'd be a good.
I mean, I'm a big believer in him as well, and he's from a different kind of background. I do like it when you get guys who come up against each other where one has been through the kind of aristocratic route, if you want to describe it as that, of going to the Olympics and getting the medals and signing with a massive promoter. And not that Davis hasn't done that, but it's just he's from the more spit and sawdust kind of background. I love those sort of matchups. People run wild with them, don't they? Particularly in the USA, where they like to try and make everything into a film. But that's the kind of thing where you could do with the 24/7 or all access or whatever. If somebody did it in the build up to that, would be tremendous.
Well, it looks as though we might be getting Gervonta Davis versus Ryan Garcia, which is kind of another one. We've got like the baby face of Ryan Garcia, and then you've got Gervonta Davis. I've always, when they started, you remember it was probably about a year ago or so, when Garcia, slightly longer, Garcia had just beaten Luke Campbell. They went on Mike Tyson's podcast and they FaceTimed Gervonta Davis. You had Mike Tyson in the middle smoking a joint, and you had Gervonta Davis and Ryan Garcia. That kind of blend of Garcia and Davis, that really does it for me. There's something quite special about that blend between those two, personality-wise, the way they both fight as well. It looks like Garcia's sort of got himself back on track a little bit as well. I thought he was good against Fortuna. Fortuna's no mug.
No.
So that looks like an interesting one. Before we wrap things up, of course, I did forget, I do apologise, we do have a British world champion at super featherweight as well, Joe Cordina, who boxes Rakimov on the Bivol Zerdo undercard. He's spoken very openly about that fight with Shakur Stevenson. That a fight you'd like to see in the future?
Yeah, why not? I mean, we spoke to him on the TalkSport show on a Saturday night a few weeks ago, and he got into that really, really quickly. We didn't even really need to raise it, because obviously that's the biggest fight out there for him, and that would be the biggest money fight out there for him. And I don't get the impression with Joe that he wants to box forever. He's got to that world title level, and once you get there, what you want to do is make as much money as you possibly can. Ideally, clean up the division and go down as an all-time great. Obviously, that's what everybody wants to do, but it's prize fighting, and they want to make as much money as they can whilst they're at that peak. And he would, that's absolutely something that he wants. And I think there is a kind of attractiveness about that for Shakur Stevenson, boxing a Brit, maybe coming over to the UK to do it. You know, he's seen Loma come over here and get really well received, and I think US fighters do kind of look at UK fight nights and think, I'd quite like to experience that. If the money's there,
Davis
I'd quite
came
like
over
to experience it. Yeah, of course, yeah.
Davis came over.
Yeah, just down the road from me at the Copper Box. I mean, that was ages ago now, wasn't it? It was like 5 years ago.
That was a good spectacle. Wasn't
Yeah,
it? That was a
yeah.
good
Mayweather
spectacle.
in town. It was, yeah.
It was good. We had the thriller ring walk.
That's it. Yeah, and Errol Spence, you know, coming over for Kell Brook. I mean, he's a mandatory, and Crawford for Burns. Same kind of thing. But you see these guys. They've already got big reputations, but before they've become quite what they go on to become. And it's great, isn't it? You kind of feel like, I was here when this was all just fields.
Yeah,
you know, it's that kind of thing, isn't it? We all have a bit of that.
Okay, right. We're just coming to the end now, so I'm going to throw it over to you. We're going to do prediction time for this weekend. So we're going to start with the big men up in Manchester, Joe Joyce versus Joseph Parker. Andy, who wins? Or who's? I always say, who's your money on? Who's my money? I'll give you £1, and you have to put it on one person. Who are you putting it on?
It's really close, you know, but I would probably, or I will put it on. I will put it on Joyce. I will put it on Joyce. I think it's going to be good, though. I do think it's going to be good, and I think it could be. I think it could be close. I think we could find a situation where we're at the end of the fight and they're standing next to the referee, and he's got a grip of each of their wrists, and we're not really sure.
Distance fight them?
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Okay, I think it's a 50-50 fight. So just to play devil's advocate, I'll go for Parker by decision.
Why not?
In that fight? Galahad versus Martinez. Maybe in the future. Galahad versus Maxi Hughes.
I'm going to go for Galahad. Yeah. I just think even though it's a big leap up in weight, I think that he has, and as well as Maxi has done recently, he has been a world champion, Galahad, and he has operated at a high level for a long time. So I would pick him.
Same. I'm going to go for Galahad in that fight, but I wouldn't be similar, although not the same as the big man in Manchester. I wouldn't be surprised with a win for Maxi Hughes either. And lastly, the fight we've just discussed: Shakur Stevenson versus Robson Conceicao.
So Stevenson, I think you have to pick Stevenson, and I'm going to say you'll stop him late.
I'm going to go for Stevenson. I'm going to go for Stevenson by stoppage as well. So we're almost there. Yeah, I think we're kind of both on the same side of the fence, or both on the fence for Joyce-Parker. So we'll see how that one plays out. But Andy, as always, thanks very much for joining us here today. It's been really nice about that little Welsh shit. Thanks to you guys as well for stopping by and checking out ID Box. And remember to please like, comment, and subscribe. Turn your notifications on, and we'll see you next time.